Well, hello everyone, and welcome again for another video. This time we are dealing with the central nervous system, a very exciting chapter teaching us about the function of different centers and cells within our central nervous system. You will notice when we try to assemble and divide our nervous system, central nervous system, into different categories. Here's the central nervous system, that's the brain and the spinal cord. You'll realize, of course, that it's much more, many more areas that we need to know beside just calling the brain and the spinal cord. We know that there are fibers going into the brain, and there are other fibers going, the brain and the spinal cord, and there are fibers going out. We're going to have a chapter dedicated for this part and another chapter dedicated for the autonomic nervous system. But for now, I would like you to remember that the afferent fibers are those that are carrying information toward the brain and the spinal cord, and then we have the efferent fibers are those that are carrying the information away from the brain and the spinal cord, away from the central nervous system. If you forget which one is which one, the efferent is has an E in the beginning, and that would remind you of the word exit. So E is for things that are exit, but in matter of fact, this is like the affected organs and the effectors, and here are the effectors fibers. This is where the F and F are coming from. But just for simplicity, E would be for exit, and so the fibers or the blood vessels that are leaving, those will be efferent fibers. So we agreed that we have afferent neurons and efferent neurons. What's really interesting and important about the central nervous system is that category right here, which are the interneurons. Now the afferent neurons, they will inform the CNS about conditions, both external and internal environment. Not necessarily that's something that you will sense. Some of those afferent fibers will carry information about your concentration of carbon dioxide, your blood pH, your blood pressure, things that you don't necessarily have to interpret consciously. Some of the information also about the posture, about the tone of your muscles, all of these informations you don't necessarily have to comprehend. But there are those information like the touch, the pain, the vision, the hearing, all of these things, yes, they are the kind of information that you feel and you can interpret. So these are the afferent neurons. The efferent, we agreed, these are the exiting neurons. They will carry instructions to the motor, mainly the muscles, but of course to the glands. If you want to increase the secretion of something, then you would increase that. For example, increasing the secretion of the adrenal glands, which is the suprarenal gland. Now then we talk about the interneurons. Now the interneurons are really making a big bulk of the central nervous system, and they communicate the impulses not only between the afferent and the efferent. In other words, like when you get stung by a bee, then your reflex, it's not just that simple. It also integrates the things you see with the memory, with the feelings, with maybe the ability of reading that word you just saw, or you're feeling something in your hand, and then just from its texture it can you can start to tell if this is an apple or an orange, and maybe it will stimulate some hunger reflexes that you have. And so we have a lot of this kind of integration. Not necessarily we understand all of them. And so the brain is really a mysterious organ, and we are now, with the aid of advanced MRI technology and PET scan, now we are capable of understanding, although we haven't cracked the full code yet. So I found this picture on the internet, and it is for a memory chip that was blown 500 times, and it just demonstrates to you the importance of those interconnections and the circuits and the microcircuits and capacitors that you place between those circuits, and this is really what causes the memory to exist. So if you take the same paradigm and you apply it to the brain, it's the complicated circuits that exist in your brain between the different neurons, and how some signals will travel immediately, some other signals maybe will travel a little slower, and then they will stimulate different responses. And when you have different responses, it's the summation of those responses that will remind you of something good that happened in the past, or it will just give you the memory that you are seeking. I mean, defining the memory in the brain, or defining emotions, love and hate and anger in the brain, all of those, imagine how so complicated, and you cannot define it just by saying, okay, this one cell is responsible for moving this muscle fiber, and when you pull a string, yeah, okay, the muscle fiber will contract. But try to explain memory based on this. Try to explain dreaming based on this, or love or hate based on this, or association to a nice song that you're listening to. So what I'm trying to put in before you is the importance of having those interneurons to make this complicated circuit that we really rely on in our brain. So for simplicity or simplification, here is just a very simple circuit between afferent neuron. This is a sensory receptor that's carrying some information to the central nervous system, and in this case would be the spinal cord, for example. It would carry it to what we call an interneuron, and now the interneuron will pass the information forward to an effector neuron or efferent neuron that will be able to like for a muscle to contract, or for an adrenal gland to be stimulated. But this is a much simplistic way. Sometimes a single nerve fiber is capable of making 10,000 different synapses, and so you can imagine the complexity associated with those interneurons and the circuits we have in the brain. So is everything in our central nervous system just neurons? No, we need the structure to support, and it's not just support. We need the cells surrounding those neurons to perform also functions. And mainly we have the glial cells, and we will talk in the next 3 or 4 slides about those glial cells. Now you remember it from listening to someone who had a brain tumor, and usually it's either meningioma or glioma. The reason for that is that why don't we have like common to have a neuroma in the brain? Because the nerve cells are, as we learned before, they don't divide, and a cancer occurs in cells that are active, and doesn't necessarily like cells that are steady or steady still, or have reached terminal differentiation and they stop dividing. So it likes more cells like the glial cells, and we will talk about 4 different types of the glial cells, and each of them has a fairly different function than the other. And the types I'm trying to tell you about are astrocytes, oligodendrites, or oligodendrocytes, depending on the book you will be reading, microglia and ependymal cells. And now I included here a picture of a CT scan for a person with glioma, just to remind you of what happens then when those cells go crazy. Does it mean we don't need them? Definitely we need them. We need each and every one of them, and we're going to spend, like I said, the next few slides talking about how important those support cells. We used to think that the glial cells are just the glue that binds the neurons together, and now we realize, oh, it's much more complicated than that, that the glial cells perform hundreds of functions, and maybe we're just now scratching the surface, and we'll realize that the glial cells are actually much more important than we previously ever thought. So here are the pictures of our glial cells. If this is the neuron, we have the most important one here is the astrocyte, and it looks like a star, as you see. That's why we call it astro, which means a star, and cyte, a cell. And then we have microglia. This is the one that is a phagocytic cell, so it wanders around trying to find something to eat. And we have oligodendrocyte. And the oligodendrocyte, if you remember, we did talk about it a little bit when we were talking about the neurons, and we described the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system was made by cells called Schwann cells, and in the central nervous system, the myelin sheath is made by those cells, the oligodendrocytes. And finally, we have those cells. We call them ependymal cells, and the ependymal cells have a function in creating and circulating the cerebrospinal fluid, and we will get into each and every one of those in the next few slides. So the astrocytes, they look like a star. They're the most abundant, and they tie the cells together, the neurons together, but they also modulate the function of the capillaries, the endothelium. They do modulate the function of the capillaries. You may remember from our blood vessel chapter that the capillaries have fenestered the endothelium, or the gaps between the cells and each other. The endothelial cells have holes in between, and that allowed small molecules to go through to nourish the interstitial space. Now, we don't have that in the brain. The endothelial cells are tight, very, very tight with each other. And that means anything that wants to go from the capillaries, from the capillary lumen into the brain, has to go through the endothelium, not in between the endothelial cells. And that really creates a tight barrier. We call that blood-brain barrier, that not everything can go through. So we're really protecting the brain with this kind of barrier. And what helps in creating this barrier is the effect the astrocytes have on the blood cell, on the capillary walls, and it ensures that the capillary walls are closed and do not allow things to randomly go through to the brain. Now, don't think that the astrocytes are themselves the barrier. No, but they will give the signals to the endothelial cells to make sure that the endothelial cells close the gap. This is how they function. Okay, so other functions for the astrocytes, they make sure that the neurons will be guided during fetal brain development into the position they are supposed to occupy. They would be important in repairing injuries, and they will make scar formation when someone has a an injury like an infarction or a bullet injury or shrapnel or something. So these are the importance of the astrocytes. They also regulate the environment surrounding the neurons. They make sure that we have very little potassium in the extracellular space. Now, if you remember, potassium levels in the extracellular space, if you drop them significantly, that will make your depolarization and excitability very eager to happen. And so one of the functions of the astrocytes is to maintain a very low level of potassium in the extracellular space. So essentially it is to make the conditions perfect for the neurons to work. If they find neurotransmitters random roaming around, they would uptake those and degrade neurotransmitters like glutamate and gamma aminobutyric acid, also known as GABA. In addition, and now this is a new function that has been recognized recently, that they enhance the synaptic formation. So it's not only a support role, now they do help the transmission of impulse from one neuron to another. And now people are thinking, well, are the astrocytes associated with memory? Are the astrocytes associated with emotion and integrated information in your brain? So this is our biggest group of cells. We call that the astrocytes, and we agreed that this is one of the 4 types of the glial cells that we have. In addition to the things I mentioned to you, they also secrete nerve growth factors, and that promotes neuron growth. It communicates electrically with neurons, like I told you, so maybe now it influences synaptic signaling and memory. Regulates the chemical composition, mainly potassium. We agreed to this, and we agreed also that when a neuron is damaged, remember the neuron cannot multiply, cannot proliferate, so we get the scar tissue formed by the astrocyte. This is an image with a fluorescent microscopy showing you an astrocyte, how it looks. Other cells, other parts of the glial cells, oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are the ones forming the myelin sheath in the CNS, and then we have the microglia. These are the immune cells of your central nervous system, but they also release low doses of growth factors that help the neurons survive. And the person who discovered this nerve growth factor got a Nobel Prize for this. You need to remember that your nerve cells last all your life. The same cell you're born with is the same, pretty much the same amount of cells you will be dying with. So you need to make sure that these cells have the longevity and they last forever. And so one of the functions they discovered for the microglia is to secrete that nerve growth factor. Now the final member of these cells, the glial cells, are the ependymal cells, and they lie cavities inside your CNS. We call that the ventricles. We have 2 lateral ventricles, and then we have the 3rd and 4th ventricles of the brain. Now in the ventricles, they help formation and circulating the cerebrospinal fluid. How do they help in circulating the cerebrospinal fluid? Because they are ciliated, then the motion of those cilia will help in the circulation. They make a pulsating movements of inside the cerebrospinal fluid, and that allows better circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. These are the cavities, and you probably went through that in the anatomy. It's not really our story to talk about in the physiology course, but these are the lateral ventricles, two, one in each hemisphere. And then we have here the third ventricle. The third ventricle is connected with a very thin tube. We call that the aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, and that will continue into the central canal of the spinal cord. And of course here we have some exit points to go into the subarachnoid space, and we will talk about the subarachnoid space and the cerebrospinal fluid circulation in just a little bit. So the central nervous system is very precious to us, so we really have to protect it. And one of the ways, as you have noticed, to protect the central nervous system is to enclose it in a bony structure, so you don't get it bumped, you don't get it hit or squeezed or twisted. And so the brain, we keep it in the skull. The spinal column will be surrounded by the vertebral column. But in addition to that, we add 3 layers of protecting and nourishing membranes, and we call those layers the meninges. Now we have from outside to inside, we have the dura mater, which means the rough, and the arachnoid matter, which means looks like a spider web, and then we have the pia matter, which means the kind or the gentle mother in a way. And we will talk about those very quickly because that's part of the anatomy, but in a little bit. We did talk about the blood-brain barrier when I was telling you about the astrocytes, and the fact that the astrocytes make sure that the endothelial cells have no gaps in between them. And this is very important. And it's also very important for you to realize that not all the drugs you take orally will find, or even by injection, will find their way into the brain because of this blood-brain barrier. So when someone has an infection in the brain, you have to give the kind of antibiotic that can actually cross the blood-brain barrier, because otherwise it will not reach. Now, of course, there are areas inside the brain which remain naked, and you don't want the blood-brain barrier to exist. And those are the areas that you want to continue to receive information continuously from the blood, so you don't want to block the things that are found in the blood. You actually, on the other hand, on the opposite, you would like to encourage those areas to read these information. And I'm talking mainly about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is supposed to monitor your oxygen level, your carbon dioxide level, your pH level. If you start blocking the information from reaching to the hypothalamus by the blood-brain barrier, how do you expect the hypothalamus to read the information? So back now to the cerebrospinal fluid, that it surrounds and cushions the brain. What's interesting about the cerebrospinal fluid, it has very little protein. But it has almost the same density as the brain, so it makes the brain almost weightless, suspended in a fluid of the same density. And so it allows the cells, the brain movement, but without being bumped, without sinking into the bony skull or rising above something that is much heavier than its own density. And so it's really the main function of the cerebrospinal fluid. It's a shock absorbent to prevent the brain from bumping against the skull, or preventing the spinal cord also from bumping against the bones. So let's look at those covering. The initial one, like I said, will be the rough one. We call that the dura mater. And the dura mater has 2 layers. Most of the layers should be adhered with each other, except in certain areas they open up, and those areas are filled with blood. We call those the sinusoids of the brain, and you'll probably remember those in the anatomy, and if you don't, it's not too important now for our physiology course. The dura mater will have some inward extensions, and those inward extensions, the biggest one of them is the one that separates the two hemispheres, the brain hemispheres from each other, and that will be the falx cerebri. And then we have tentorium cerebelli, which will separate. It's a sheet that will enfold and will sort of making a partial separation between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And finally we have the falx cerebelli, which will separate the right and the left halves of the cerebellum. Now, this was the dura mater. We go then to the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid mater looks like a spider web, and it's a transparent membrane over the brain surface. The subarachnoid space, the space that's underneath it, it will have the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the pia mater would be a very gentle, very thin membrane that follows all the contours of the brain and dips into the grooves, and the grooves we call them sulci, the plural of sulcus of the brain. And you don't see it because it's so adherent, but it's the shiny, glistening sarin wrap that surrounds the brain. And so here we have the different layers. This is the dura mater, and like I said, the dura mater has two layers, and sometimes they open up and they make venous sinuses in between. And this is the arachnoid mater, and finally here is the pia mater. Sometimes we get inflammation and infections in those meninges, mainly in the pia and the arachnoid mater, and it can be fatal. It can be viral meningitis, or it can be bacterial meningitis. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid will be formed mainly by the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus, these are masses of pia mater, and that pockets, these pockets will be formed by the ependymal cells, and that will secrete to you most of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid has to undergo a circulation, and a big amount will be absorbed every day. Any blockage to this amount can be fatal. Any blockage during the fetal development can result in what we call hydrocephalus or hydrocephalus, where the child head is significantly big, and of course that can result in significant amount of pressure over the brain during development, and of course results in a very nasty outcome. And usually it's interfered with. Even with intrauterine surgery, they will go in and open up a channel to allow the cerebrospinal fluid to circulate. So again, the same slide we talked about earlier about the blood-brain barrier and the importance of it, as it limits the drugs and the treatment of the brain, because the endothelial cells are so closed with each other. There are no gaps in between the endothelial cells when it comes to the brain capillaries, so everything that needs to leave the capillaries has to go through the endothelial cells and not in between the endothelial cells. Okay? So, now that we covered the cells that are surrounding the neurons, we covered the glial cells, we covered the cerebrospinal fluid, now it's time to talk more about the neurons themselves. The central nervous system will have the brain and the spinal cord, and it's estimated that it's about 100 billion neurons in the brain. It's also estimated that if you line up all the neurons in one person's brain, it can extend as between Earth and the moon. This is how complicated those circuits are, and how they would enable you for everything: the conscious regulation of your activities, your emotion, your subconscious movements, your control of blood pressure, your control of heart rate, control of hormonal secretion. Everything will be controlled by the central nervous system. So it's a very, very complicated system, as we will realize in the next few slides of this presentation. Now, the brain, we can subdivide that into a brain stem. This is the very primitive part of our brain, and if you compare the brain to a tree, then the stump of the tree will be your brain stem, and the big branches, the bushy branches, those will be your cerebrum. Then we have the cerebellum, the little brain, and we will talk about that. And we have the diencephalon, which is mainly the hypothalamus and thalamus, and some people add also the epithalamus to it. And finally, but not least, last but not least, will be our cerebrum, or the cerebral hemispheres. Cerebral hemispheres will have the cerebral cortex, but we also have what we call basal nuclei or basal ganglia, and we will talk about each and every one of those in the next few slides. So, certain things you need to realize when you are reading this chapter. You will see often in some books we're talking about rostral and caudal, and rostral will be towards the forehead and caudal will be towards the tail, and this is happens because of the way we developed. So you will see anything that goes to the front, we'll start calling that rostral, and this part here will be caudal, which is towards the tail. The reason for that is really the brain was up this way, and then it flipped to become this part becomes the front and this one becomes the back, but this was really initially towards the tail, and that's why it's keeping the name caudal, and the other part will be the rostral, which means close to the nose. Okay, so as I told you, the brain is this very, if you look at the cerebral hemispheres, you will see those convoluted structures and folds and grooves, and that's really to increase the area of gray matter. And the less developed the animal is, the less you see of those grooves and what we call sulci, and you don't see well developed what folds, or what we call gyri. If I would cut the brain in half sagittally this way, then you will see that the two hemispheres are connected together by a highway of fibers that link the information from the right to the left and vice versa, and we call that the corpus callosum. You don't see it from here. You would need to cut through and make a sagittal section in order for you to see this. We will talk a lot about the cerebellum later on, and the cerebellum is this portion here. What's interesting about the cerebellum is that although it's about 10% of the total size of the brain, it contains about 50% of the brain neurons. So that emphasizes the importance of the cerebellum in controlling so many things, coordinating the motions, coordinating the talk, and even in the memory, some of our repetitive motions like playing piano or walking, it's really carried by the cerebellum. And we will talk about the functions of the cerebellum later on. The brainstem is the remaining of the brain if we take everything out. So if I would take those out, what's remaining is the stump, and that is our brain, the brainstem, not this part, but this part and this part. We will have the medulla oblongata, and then we will have the pons, and then we have the midbrain. Over this is the pons, and the midbrain will be this part. Medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. So we will talk about that later on. This is the diencephalon, and the diencephalon will be your thalamus and hypothalamus. So this table here will summarize to you the areas in your brain and the functions of those. So this will serve as a really good review for you when you are reading this chapter to go through the table. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that brainstem. Again, we agreed this is the oldest region, and because it's the oldest, it's really controls life-sustaining processes, not much involved into the integration of memory or dreams or higher functions of the brain, but like reflexes, maintaining positions of the body in space. And the areas, we will talk about each of them now, is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. But I think we will start with the medulla. The medulla is the lowermost area, or the distalmost or the caudalmost area of the brainstem. So here's the medulla oblongata. This is this part here, and you don't necessarily have to know the embryonic origin of the medulla oblongata. But what's interesting about the medulla is that the motor signals will cross at this level. And this is a very important thing. So in other words, your motor information that's coming, they are the ones that are controlling your right hand are really coming from the left side of your brain, but then they will cross here. 90% or so of the fibers will cross at the medulla oblongata level, or decussate as we call it, into the other side. So this is one of the very important aspects of the medulla oblongata. In addition to that, they will contain, of course, important tracts. You need to realize that the information that's climbing up from the spinal cord has to go through the medulla oblongata, and conversely, the information that are coming down from the brain also to the spinal cord, they have to cross and go through the medulla oblongata. So they will contain both ascending and descending fibers, and in addition to that, we're going to have some centers within the medulla oblongata. We will have olivary nucleus, and the olivary nucleus looks like an olive. That's why we call it the olivary nucleus. Here is one of them. We call that the inferior olivary nucleus. You don't have to remember all those, but it will relay the information to the cerebellum, and therefore it's associated with coordination and controlling tone of the muscles, but otherwise we also have lots of centers here for nerves, for cranial nerves, like for the vagus nerve and for the trigeminal nerves, and therefore the medulla oblongata has cardiac centers, vasomotor centers, and respiratory centers are built in. Like we said earlier, the medulla oblongata is part of this primitive brain that its main function really is to maintain life and sustain life, but without really higher functions of the upper centers of the brain. The reticular formation, we will get back into that, but we will see we can't really name the reticular formation and say this is it, this is the reticular formation. The reticular formation, as you will realize, are scattered all over the brain, and here is one of those areas are associated with this kind of loose network of nuclei, and we will talk in a very short bit about the reticular formation. But for now, just appreciate the fact that we have some of the reticular formation centers are present in the medulla oblongata. Otherwise, like we agreed, the medulla oblongata will control some of the cardiac functions, and it has vasomotor center, so it can adjust the blood vessels diameter, and therefore it can control your blood pressure. It has respiratory centers, and it also has reflex centers for coughing, sneezing, gagging. Of course, we have the vagus nerve coming out from it, so it's no surprise that we see all those reflexes, which are really mainly associated with the vagus nerve. So if we go from the medulla oblongata to the pons, which is right above it, which is this guy, again we will find that the area where tracks are going up, tracks are going down, but also some tracks are going to the cerebellum, and we call that cerebellopontine tract. And but you will also see some other centers within the pons of the brainstem. Again, this is the medulla oblongata, this is the pons, and this is the midbrain. The pons will have, again, like we agreed, ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts, things going to the brain, things coming down from the brain, and the pathways in and out from the cerebellum. As I told you, the pontine cerebello and cerebellopontine. And we have centers for cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now the reticular formation, if you remember, some of the reticular formation was in the medulla oblongata, but some also are associated here with the pons, and we will find some of that reticular formation, and we will talk in greater details about those the function of those reticular formation in a very short bit. Finally, the midbrain. Again, we will have information going up and down. This is a highway. Things can go cross from the brain to the spinal cord and vice versa. It will contain the motor nuclei for cranial nerve number 3, which is oculomotor, and cranial nerve number 4, that's the trochlear. It contains what we call cerebral aqueduct, and the cerebral aqueduct is connecting the third and the fourth ventricle. This is a very common place to get clogged, and if it does get clogged, of course, the intracranial pressure is elevated significantly, and that can result in death. It has some specific areas, and I would like to just mention those for now, but we will come to them later on. We will have some areas that are dark. We call that substantia nigra, and we have the red nucleus, and they're pinkish colors because they have lots and lots of blood vessels. You don't necessarily have to remember all the areas of the midbrain. Those you will go, when you go into anatomy, you will learn about them. But what I really want you to remember is this guy here, the substantia nigra. And this is from, as the name implies, it's a dark area, dark gray area to blackish, because it's pigmented with the same pigment that makes our skin color, the melanin pigment. And they discovered that degeneration of this area is associated with Parkinsonism. So it's a good area to remember, and remember that the substantia nigra is found in the midbrain. So this is the red nucleus I mentioned earlier, and this is part of the reticular formation. Meanwhile, the substantia nigra is this part, and this opening here is the cerebral aqueduct which connects the third and the fourth ventricles together. Okay, so that covers our brainstem. We talked about the medulla oblongata, we talked about the pons, and we talked about the different functions of the pons, the medulla oblongata. What's interesting about the medulla oblongata, it is the level where the nerve fibers, the motor nerves, decussate, mean cross to the other side, 90% of the fibers. And we talked about the midbrain being the area where the substantia nigra, and we agreed about the function of the substantia nigra, how it controls the muscle tone, and they discovered that it's a very common place to be damaged when they autopsied patients with Parkinsonism. They found damage in the substantia nigra, so they think the substantia nigra is really associated with this nasty and awful disease, Parkinsonism. So, gets us then to the diencephalon or diencephalon, and we will see that it has two components, and sometimes we add a third one, which is the epithalamus. The two main components are the hypothalamus and the thalamus. Hypo means below, so we have the thalamus and the one below it. Although the hypothalamus is really small, it's not bigger than the size of an almond, a small almond, but it controls almost everything in your body, and you will see how important this hypothalamus is. This is the area of your brain that I told you that you don't have a well-established blood-brain barrier to allow things to go in and out freely from the blood to the hypothalamus, and therefore the hypothalamus is your litmus test for what's going on in your blood, and therefore it can have the ability to regulate it. So let's start with the thalamus. The thalamus is really the highway between the higher centers of the cerebral cortex and everything else. So everything, almost everything, has to go through the thalamus. But that's not really everything. So although it is known as the gateway to the cerebral cortex, there are a lot of motor activities that are regulated in the thalamus, a lot of feedback. It's involved in memory and emotional functions as part of what we will know in a short bit that we call the limbic system. And you don't have to remember this now. We will talk about it in the next few slides. And it is a relay station. It controls the information that going between the cerebral cortex and the brainstem and the spinal cord. It's also capable of what we call crude awareness, but it does not distinguish because it's a relay centers. So you can get some information, but you don't know what this information is, and that's what we mean by crude awareness of some sensations, but you can't distinguish neither the location or the intensity of them. Where is it? This is the thalamus is over here, and then the hypothalamus is the area below it. So gets us to now that very interesting part of our brain of the diencephalon, which would be the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, like I said, this is the hypothalamus over here. It's no bigger than a small almond, and but as you will see in the next few slides, it really controls almost everything. It controls the hormonal secretions because it can regulate the pituitary gland secretion. It regulates the growth, the metabolism, the reproduction, the stress responses. It controls the blood pressure. It controls the gastrointestinal secretion, your hunger, whether you're hungry or not, the thirst centers. It has thirst centers for you. Has the heart. It controls the heart rate. It controls the temperature of your system. It can activate the heat loss center when your temperature is high, or activates the heat promoting centers when your temperature is too low. Now, of course, these things can get messed up. This thermostat that we have inside the hypothalamus can get messed up when you have infection, and that's why even though you are hot, you shiver to generate more heat. And we will get into that when we talk about the regulation of our temperature. But this is a little bit about the hypothalamus. More information, more things that it's capable of controlling. Food and water intake. It has, it secretes a peptide called neuropeptide Y that's under the regulation of other influencers, like your a hormone called ghrelin that's coming from the stomach. When you're hungry, it will stimulate neuropeptide Y. We have another hormone that's called cholecystokinin, and this is a satiety, gives you the feeling of being full after a meal. Also have receptors for insulin, has receptors for glucose, some amino acids, to control whether you're hungry or not. And like I said earlier, it secretes a neuropeptide Y, but also secretes melanocortin. And there is a lot of research now going on with this area and trying to understand the opioid-like chemicals like the ones found in marijuana and how they regulate hunger. And of course, this is a multi-billion industry trying to identify the magic pill that can block the appetite for people so they can lose weight. Anyhow, back to the hypothalamus and the functions of the hypothalamus. It also regulates what we call the daily rhythm, sleeping and waking up. It has an association with the memory, the emotional behavior. So you see, it's almost in control of everything in our system. Again, that summarizes what we talked about. It controls body temperature, thirst, urine output, hunger, food intake, anterior pituitary hormone secretion, and the posterior pituitary is actually made in the hypothalamus, and we will talk about that when we get into the endocrine system. It controls the uterine contractions, even controls sexual desires. And there is a lot, again, of research going on in that areas, and sexual maturity. It serves as autonomic nervous system coordinator. It plays an emotional behavioral pattern, and it helps in this sleep-wake cycle. The other thing that helps in the sleep-wake cycle is the epithalamus, which mainly is the pineal gland that is found behind or below this, below the hypothalamus. And the pineal gland is secreting a very important hormone we all know called melatonin, which is supposed to regulate your rhythm. I don't know if I have a slide of it. Yeah, I do. So the pineal gland, the pineal gland pineal gland is over here, and it secretes to you the melatonin, which does regulate your circadian rhythm. And we all know when we travel somewhere and have a jet lag, that the pineal gland hormone melatonin can help us reestablish our circadian rhythm. We also know that people who work night shifts, they have the melatonin sort of the opposite, because then they need to have all the excitement hormones and awakening hormones like cortisone and thyroxine, adrenaline, all the hormones you need during activity. You want that to be during the day, but those people who are awake at night and sleep during the day, they have it, of course, the opposite way. That's not necessarily a good thing, and that actually can mess up quite a bit of their metabolism, and it's even suspected of having an effect on tumorigenesis later on, people who have irregular sleeping pattern. We will talk about sleep later on in this lecture, and the importance of having a good night's sleep, how your body is recovering through process of anabolism and digestion from lengthy, stressful day. And so the importance of the circadian rhythm and having night and day hormones associated with night activity and day activity, it's very, very important. And of course, we know the information through our eyes, which senses the differences between light and night. And it has been also suggested that the lack of this kind of circadian rhythm is associated with increase of suicidal rate during winter in some dark countries like the very north of Canada or in Scandinavia, when the rate of depression is highest at a time when there is no sunlight. And that has been attributed a lot to the lack of the circadian rhythm. And part of it, as we agreed, is controlled by the hypothalamus, and then that will be in regulation of the hormones here. Now I know where it is, of the pineal gland. So we covered the diencephalon and the brainstem, and now we are going into much higher and much more convoluted centers. Most of the things in the cerebrum or the cerebral hemispheres we don't necessarily understand, but we are starting to understand it now better than before. So we can divide the brain into two halves, and we will see later in this lecture that the two halves sometimes have distinct functions. You will see that the left side is associated more with the motor activity, and the right side is associated more with dreaming activity and creative activity like music and so forth. But we will talk about that later today in the lecture. What we need to realize now is that the cerebrum is divided into two halves, the right and left, and it's connected by this highway, what we call the corpus callosum, between the two. And inside the cerebrum, we will find the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei scattered all over, and in four distinct areas. And we will talk about the importance of the basal ganglia or basal nuclei in a very short bit. So the outer surface, it has those grooves, and the grooves will separate bulks of tissues together, what we call folds or gyri, and it's a very, very complex system. We can divide the brain into lobes, and those are divided by those deep sulcus or deep sulci we see here. And some of the sulci are so prominent, like the central sulcus here, which is this guy. It would separate or at least makes the distinction between the frontal lobe, which is this lobe here, and the parietal lobe, which is that guy. Then we have the temporal lobe, and if we remove the temporal lobe a little bit, then we will see the insula, and back here we will see the occipital lobe. So the frontal lobe, it's mainly associated with voluntary motor activities. The parietal will be mainly associated with the sensory. The occipital is mainly associated with the visual activity, and the temporal lobe, that's where the hearing, the smell, the learning memory, and some of the aspects of the vision and emotion, like realizing what is the picture you just saw and whether it has some good memory or bad memory. And then we have the insula, which is buried underneath here. We have to pull the temporal lobe aside in order for us to see the insula, and that's associated with language skills and other kind of sensory information. So the cerebral cortex has the gray matter on the outside, which means that these are the cell bodies, and the white matter, and it's white because of the myelin sheath. Because of the fat that is by the myelin sheath. Now the gray matter, again, that will indicate the cells, the cell bodies, and that's why we have all the folds to increase the amount of cell bodies that we can have in the cerebral hemispheres. And we agreed that we can divide it into 5 lobes, the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and of course we have the insula, which is not shown here in this list. Okay, I was telling you earlier about the corpus callosum, and this is it. This is the corpus callosum here, and that's what unites the two, but here we cut it sagittally. And so this is an actual brain where you can see here the folds and the sulci and the gyri, but you can also see here the corpus callosum. This, what you see here, is your third ventricle, and this is of course the fourth ventricle, and we agreed that the canal that's connecting the third and the fourth ventricle together, that will be called the aqueduct. Okay, so anyhow, this is the cerebellum, and let's talk now about more of the cerebral cortex. I told you earlier that we will have basal ganglia and nucleus, or nuclei, and the basal ganglia we will have, you don't have to remember those names, but we have the caudate nucleus, and we have the putamen and the globus pallidus, and we have the colostrum. So all of them together, we will call those areas of gray matter inside the white matter. We will call these guys the basal ganglion, because they are very close, or the basal nuclei, because they're very close to the base of the brain. That's why we call them the basal ganglion or the basal nuclei. So we did talk about those briefly when I showed you the image of the brain, and we talked about the occipital lobe, how it carries the visual input, the temporal lobe, how it carries the auditory sensation, and the parietal lobe, how it carries the sensory input, and the frontal lobe, how it carries the motor activity and also thoughts and emotions. And by the way, damage to the frontal lobe is known to affect the behavior, enough so that in the beginning of the 20th century they thought it's a good idea to take from patients with aggression, they thought it's a good idea to take the frontal lobe out in what they call frontal lobectomy. And of course they created zombies who weren't capable of doing anything. They weren't aggressive, but they, they weren't really alive. You took all their memory, you took all the emotions. Yes, they can walk, but they had no voluntary control for many things, and it was essentially a crime to do it. Luckily, they stopped doing it. So let's talk about the biggest one of them, the parietal lobe, that will be associated or has the centers for somesthetic sensations. So the sensations from your body, pain, touch, heat sensations coming from all over your body, and they're localized based on how important really those bodies are. And you will see that the representation is not really by the size. So the sensory cartoon that you can draw here that represents, you will see the tongue is occupying a really big part of the area, the gyrus, that's associated with the sensory, the somatosensory cortex here on the parietal, in the parietal lobe. and then you see the face has a really major part also of that gyrus, and then the hand. But then when you get to the feet and you know, the thigh and the leg, you will see that it's not that represented, because there's very little complicated moves that are initiated, you know, at your knee level. Whereas if you think the complexion of the moves you get from the hands or the fingers, or from your mouth, or the facial expression, or the tongue, or the pharyngeal muscles, you will see that it's much more complicated, and therefore it has to be much better represented on the brain, because of the complexity of those moves, compared to the moves that you need to do, for example, with the muscles of your back, which are not really, are not much. Oh, these are the muscles, I'm sorry, but I'm sorry, these are the sensory, I mixed them up, sorry. So this is the sensory information, the sensation that you get from the tongue, from the pharynx, from the lips, from the hand. All of these would be information that you really need a lot of the sensory cortex to cover. And on the opposite, this is the motor cortex here, which will be this gyrus here, the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe. And you will see again that it's the areas that you want to have better represented, like the face, the hand. These are the ones that are really very well represented. In the meanwhile, you will see the areas like the trunk, although the size of the trunk is significantly big, but you will see that the area is really small. How did we find that out? Injuries, and when someone has an infarction or something in those areas, then we knew that this is the area that covers, you know, the motion for the trunk, or for the hand, or, you know, for the mouth. And more recently now we have our MRI technology, which allows us to map really more accurately which areas associated with what. So the primary motor cortex, which I showed you here, that would be present in the frontal lobe, and it's again, it depends on how important your organ is, or your area of the body is, and you will see that represented. It's not by the size of the hand, but it's how complicated the motions of the hand, and how much brain tissues you need in order for you to control those complex moves. So it's really think of the hand as a very complicated puppet, that you need so many strings in order to make a perfect motion and very coordinated motion between the muscles of the hand, or the muscles of the face and the mouth, or the tongue. But in the meanwhile, think of the trunk as something you don't really have to pull too many strings, and therefore it's just a simple movement, bending forward and backward and maybe sideways, and so you don't really need much of strings to that puppet. And so that is just an oversimplification of why do we have a bigger representation of areas like the hand and the face versus areas like, you know, the ankle and the feet. Okay, so is that it? When you are pulling a string, is that it? Is that all your motor activity? Of course not. You realize always when you move your hand that you are moving it in a very controlled fashion. When you are pulling, when you're writing something, you don't have to think too much. You don't have to say to such and such muscle you have to contract 20% and the other muscle have to contract 15% and 100%. You don't have to do that. When you're writing, when you're talking, when you're smiling, when you're laughing, you will realize that there is a lot of integration of those movements, and much better control of the tone in a very complicated way. And so it can't be just the primary motor structure. It just cannot be someone pulling the chords of a puppet, the puppeteer pulling the chords, but it has to be also how much are you pulling it, and why are you pulling it, and will the are you moving a muscle in your face because you're happy? So it has to be associated with certain emotion. You don't smile when you're angry. So when you see someone you like or you don't like, what kind of emotions should you express? If someone touches you, whether it's a stranger or it's someone you like, but it's the same touch, but the response, your own response will differ, whether it's something that you're expecting and something you like, or something that's unwelcome. So it has to be a much more complicated system of higher motor and sensory areas, and there comes the association areas. There comes the areas that are associated with memory and emotions and other centers that we don't necessarily understand very well. But like I said earlier, now with advanced technology, now we are indeed capable of understanding them. So we have those areas, and some of them are scattered in the brain, and they will be controlling your movements. Some of them, yes, are present in the parietal area, but that's not all. Some of them are present all over the cerebrum, all over the brain, and they will be associated with memory or emotion. And really a very, very complicated and very intricate system that most of the scientists themselves do not necessarily understand. What I want you to know, however, is that there are tracks that are connecting those together, and you cannot divide the brain away from each other. You can say, okay, this is the sensory, this is the motor, and this is it. It's much more complicated than that. It has to be connected to the memory, and we hardly know where the memory is. We think we know. We know that the hippocampus is, or hippocampus is associated with memory, but we also know that there are other areas in the brain that are associated with memory. So all of these areas have to feed together, and all of them have to project to each other, and it's the summation and the outcome from all of those together will coordinate the emotions, will coordinate your response to a feeling. It's not just a simple manner of saying, here is the feeling, here is the motor, and this you will see throughout our chapter. So these are the projection tracks. In addition, you have the commissural tracks, and the commissural tracks, you will have bridges that are bridging the right and left, and these are very important to let the right side know what the left side is doing. And in matter of sensation, in matter of motions, many of the things cross together, and the memory is shared between the right and left, and you have to have this coordination between the two sides. And like I said, the main highway between the right and left is what I showed you in the cadaver picture, which was the corpus callosum. The basal nuclei, we agreed of the cerebrum, or the brain, that we have the gray matter on the outside, and then we have the white matter on the inside. But we also agreed that we have areas of gray matter that are buried inside that white matter, and that's what we called the basal nuclei, or basal ganglia. And those, they do receive areas from the substantia nigra, if you remember the substantia nigra of the midbrain, and they send signals back, and they are involved in the motor control. They are involved in regulating the tone of the muscles. And we know that these areas can be severely affected in diseases like Parkinsonism. We also know that the substantia nigra of the midbrain is also affected in diseases like Parkinsonism. So In addition to the basal ganglia, in addition to the cerebral cortex, we can classify now areas. We can take areas among the brain. We used to think of what we call the limbic system, that it's a very well identified system, but now we realize that it's much more scattered than we thought. So we really thought that this is the limbic system. We have an area here as part of the limbic association cortex, and we thought the thalamus, and then here is an area we call the hippocampus, and then we have the amygdala, which is very highly associated with emotions, and the hippocampus is very highly associated with memory. We thought that this is it. We thought that this mapping of what we loosely call the limbic system is really everything we know about, but now we realize that the limbic system is much more than that. Now the limbic system has control over emotions, has control over expressing fear or anger or happiness towards a certain situation or towards certain individual. It is associated. There are people whom they found that when they have a lesion in the amygdala, that they express behaviors that are aggressive behaviors. We also know that people who have Alzheimer, for example, and diseases that affect the memory, that it's usually associated with a lesion around the area here we call the hippocampus. So you will see in a little bit the function of those limbic systems, but let's talk more about the areas and mapping of those areas. Again, we initially thought that this is the limbic system, but then we realized now that there is part of the frontal lobe is also associated with the limbic system, and much more than that. What's more important for me is to realize something like the hippocampus being the area that's associated. I would like you to remember that the hippocampus is associated a lot with memory, and nowadays for people with Alzheimer, for example, they are thinking now to record the memory. Okay, this will sound like a sci-fi movie or episode, but they want to record the movie that one would have in the hippocampus and then store that on a chip, and then you can erase the memory that you have in the hippocampus and then put another chip in, which gives you maybe better memory. And so it may sound weird now, but you never know. There are scientists, some very serious scientists, working on changing the memory or reinstalling the memory back after you've lost it, or making a backup memory. Imagine if you have a situation where you can back up your memory, everything you have on the hippocampus you can back on a chip, and then you can introduce it back later on. So I would like you to remember something about the hippocampus, how important it is for the memory, and the amygdala, how important it is for the emotions. So the limbic system is really associated with a lot of emotional things, with a sense of pleasure when you accomplish something, and a sense of fear. It's very again a very mysterious system. Our mysterious because it's very hard to do an experiment on a human where you can ablate an area and then you find out how removing that area affects the person. But now with the help of MRI, well, maybe we think that such and such area is involved with the memory or with fear. If you show a person a fearful picture or someone he hates, and then this area starts to shine up on the MRI or on the PET scan, then you know that this area becomes active when the person is trying to remember, or the person is angry, or the person is happy. And we started to map a lot of those things to the limbic system. So I really would like you to remember a little bit about the limbic system. Now, as you will realize, the language is not a simple motion. It's not a simple motor function, but it involves a lot of things. You have to involve memory in it. You have to involve the motor activity. You have to involve the listening, because you're listening to yourself when you're talking. And so it's a really complicated area, and there are certain areas in the brain we know that when they are damaged, and like the Broca's area, when it's damaged, by the way, it's mainly on the left side for the right-handed people, and that governs the ability to speak. Meanwhile, the Wernicke area is to formulate a coherent pattern of speech. So of course, if the Broca's area is damaged, then the person has complete aphasia. But if the Wernicke area is damaged, then the person is speaking but doesn't make much sense, or mixes up words when he says, and he has some kind of speech impediments or dyslexia. Association area, and I'm going to end this part of the chapter with talking a little bit about the association areas, which I already told you earlier. You do need this kind of projection. You do need the kind of association between the motor and the sensory, and between the motor and the memory areas. And when you're walking, you don't think about which muscle is contracting. When you are writing, when you are talking, when you are smiling, when you are drinking, all of these things have to be associated, although they are motor activities, but they have to have some kind of projection into motor areas, and they have to have feedback somehow from the way you walk, and your muscles have to talk back to your brain, and your brain has to tune down or tune up the tone in your muscles, or the action of your muscles. So we never gave in the past, and I would say maybe 20-30 years ago, much of a thought to these association areas, but now we realize how important and how interesting those association areas are, without going through too much details. The very final thing I'd like to bring up in this half of the chapter is what we call the cerebral lateralization. So we will see that the left hemisphere in right-handed people is associated with certain things, and the right side of the brain, or the cerebral cortex, is associated with others. In general, the left side, categorically speaking, would be specialized, especially if you're right-handed, will be with the spoken and written language, breaking down information, analysis, in a linear way. The right side will be the creative, the musical, the artistic skills. But of course, this is what we think, and again, this is based on information we received from people who had damage to a certain area, tumor or infection or a bullet or something that damaged a certain area in the brain, and that resulted in us understanding a little bit more about the differences of the information that are handled between the right and the left. So the left side is what we call the dominant. If you are right-handed, remember, everything crosses to the other side, and it develops with age, and we start to teach those areas of the brain that the music is supposed to sound like that. When you are born, you're indifferent to music. It's all noises to you. Then you start to develop some kind of association to a smell, or association to a touch. Then you realize what is nice and what's not, and what's good music and what's not good music, and all of these skills, your cerebral cortex, unlike those basic functions that are supported by the primitive brain, like your brainstem, those functions you have in the upper centers in the cerebral cortex will be something that you learn, and you will start to dedicate certain areas of your brain toward language skills. That's why they always say that it's much easier to learn certain languages, or to play the piano, for example,
when you are young. But playing the piano is one of those things we haven't really touched on, because believe it or not, the memory for that can be all the way back in the cerebellum, and has nothing to do with the motor areas or the motor association areas. But it's the memory to play. Of course, if your motor activity is completely shut down in your cerebral cortex, then the cerebellum is not going to help. But what I'm trying to tell you is, imagine if you have a robot, and the robot has strings, and the strings are pulling on the arm of the robot, but it's the computer code that you put to pull all those strings at the same time in a coordinated way to allow the robot to work. And that code for playing those repetitive movements, it can be found in the cerebellum. This is what we think, and not in the cerebrum. Remember, the cerebellum, it contains about 50% of the neurons, so now we realize it has much more functions than we previously thought. So I'm gonna stop the first part of this chapter here before you fall asleep watching this video, and but I think the second half of the chapter we will try to cover it during our lecture, and I hope you will find this video helpful when you're reading this very interesting chapter. And we will, by having this video, we are freeing a lot of our time so we can bring up discussions, and we talk about this very interesting chapter and very interesting brain functions. And we will talk more about the memory, the short-term memory, the sleep, the electroencephalogram, and we'll talk about all that when we either in the second part of this video demonstration, or in during the lecture. So thank you for viewing this one. Again, I hope it will be helpful to you, and have a great day.